Can Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl be stopped? And can the Kings do it? We're going to talk about it today on the very first playoff edition of Locked On Los Angeles Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Kings fans, happy Monday. Happy first day of the playoffs. You're listening to Locked On Los Angeles Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. My name is Sarah Ampato, your host. Been covering the Kings since, well, the last time they disastrously appeared in the playoffs. Been covering the Kings for Locked On since we started the Locked On NHL side of the Locked On Network. And this is the first year that I actually get to talk playoff hockey with all of you. Haven't even really gotten to talk AHL playoffs. It's been a weird couple of years, but we're here. We're talking all about the Kings who are taking on the Oilers in the first round of the playoffs. And to do that today, we have got the host of Locked On Oilers. He's brand new to the network. I'm really excited to be one of his first big crossover events here with Locked On. So on today's show, we're going to hear all about what we have to look forward to in this series, which we're all going to hope is going to go, the distance. I mean, it'd be cool to not need 7 games, but we're just going to hope that everyone has a good time. So on today's show, we're talking with Brett Howden, host of Locked On Oilers, all about what we can expect in this matchup. So without further ado, actually with some further ado, because I do need to mention before we get into that today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. Brett's going to talk with you about BetOnline later on in today's show, but let's get to it right now and learn all about the Kings-Oilers first round playoff matchup.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On Network. I am joined here by Sarah from the Locked On Kings podcast. I am Brett from Locked On Oilers podcast. And no, you are not in the wrong place here. We do have both Locked On Oilers and the Locked On Kings crossover for the playoffs. Oh, I'm so happy. The playoffs are here, Sarah. Oilers and Kings for the first time since 1992. A long 30 years since then, and a lot of storylines going into our series.
It feels unbelievable, honestly, that it's been that long since these two teams. I know the real rivalry is like Battle of Alberta and Kings and Ducks and Sharks, like California hockey, but it really feels like it should have been more recent than 30 years ago that these teams met up.
Absolutely. And certainly looking back since 1990 and 1980s, certainly before my time, these were two teams that were facing off against each other and does have a little bit of the history against each other. But like you said, it just kind of fell off. Before we got on, I was talking about the decade of darkness and just how poor my team was doing with the Oilers. But now we're doing pretty well. Yeah. And now we are getting these matchups, hopefully, in the future as well. LA has quite the young team, and that's where I kind of want to start, because that seems to be where the questioning starts for LA, as LA does have, especially on that back end, a young, inexperienced back end. How are you kind of feeling going into a series against a high-powered offense for the Oilers?
I think we're going to learn a lot about what exactly this defense is made of, especially knowing that they're going to be without Drew Doughty for the playoffs. And he's been the guy. He's held down that blue line, and now our veterans are Alex Edler, who's been around for a while. He's seen just about everything, but it's been a little wild playing for Vancouver that he's seen the playoffs too. We've got Ole Mata, who exists. At least has kind of that pedigree of, having been with the Penguins through playoffs and cup runs. So he has that experience, even though he's not, the greatest defenseman. And the rest of the team, the rest of the blue line is very young. But a couple of guys who this is their first season in the NHL, guys called up from the AHL. And it's very much defense by committee right now. And I think that, they've had games where they've looked fantastic. They've had games where you're like, I can't believe this kid's only played, 30 NHL games. And then you've had games where you're like, oh, he's only played 30 NHL games. And, no greater challenge than being like, here's your first playoff experience. Here's Connor McDavid.
No kidding. No kidding. You can certainly ask the New York Rangers defense about
Yeah.
how Connor McDavid cuts through. I wanted, because you brought up Drew Doughty. Drew Doughty had 7 goals, 24 assists for 31 points for the Kings. Now, with him being out of the lineup, does that secondary scoring, especially with the defense, I'm sorry for bringing up the defense here, but it seems like it's going to be kind of whose defense will kind of outlast the other. Is there secondary scoring there from the defense now without Doughty, especially with Sean Durzi in the lineup?
Yeah, I think Durzi's probably got the most sort of nose for offense. We've gotten, we probably haven't gotten a whole ton of goals from the defense, but there's a lot of playmaking coming from the back end that, if they're not scoring, at least they're helping set up their teammates. I'd love to see a couple more goals come back from the blue line, but it so far hasn't been too much of a problem. Like there haven't been many games where I'm like, oh man, if only that shot from, someone else went in, and they're getting a lot of guys who are getting comfortable with that sort of net front role. So they're going to put in the tip in or the deflection or whatever. But yeah, I mean, missing Doughty and the offense that he brings, especially this year that he was actually having a really good season. He looked kind of like Drew Doughty of old. And you're like, okay, I know I can count on him in big moments. And now it's a bunch of guys proving themselves, which could be fun too. A little scarier though.
Well, especially with, I mentioned Sean Durzi. It seemed like Tobias Bjornfot was kind of going to be not necessarily the go-to for the Kings defensively, but kind of that guy who kind of poked through as the surprise. And then Sean Durzi came up. Yeah. And I'm going to mention just maybe the experience with Doughty may have rubbed off on Durzi as well.
Yeah. I think Durzi's also he's one of the top prospects for the team. And yeah, is a little ahead of schedule in terms of hitting the NHL, but and he's had his ups and downs. He's definitely had games where he has looked, inexperienced. There's a few people on Twitter who are like, can we make him a forward instead? Which, I get it. Yeah, I think that even if Doughty's not playing, I know that he's still there around the team to, that is a man who has a thought about everything. And I think will tell it to you if you're another player. So they're here.
No kidding.
Out on the ice.
No kidding. Well, speaking of people who certainly will voice their thoughts, and this is a guy who has, speaking of veterans, has won the cup. Unfortunately, will be his final year in Dustin Brown, and also next to him is Anze Kopitar. As sitting here in Edmonton, you're kind of wondering, oh man, these are a couple guys that have been here before, and do you really think those two are going to really rub their experience off on the older guys and just be like, hey, we may be, if it gets to a tough spot, being like, hey, this may be a tough spot now. We've been here before. We can do it again.
Yeah. I think that both of them, Kopitar and Brown, are very much the heart and soul of the team. They're guys that don't speak a whole ton in the room to the other guys, but when they do, you stand up, you listen. And I think that having both of them there, especially for the young guys who might be getting nervous, if Anze Kopitar tells me to calm down, I'm going to calm down, So I think they're both very calming presences. And you mentioned Dustin Brown. He announced this is his final season. And the playoffs instantly took a whole different meaning. I think a lot of Kings fans were like, whatever happens, happens. And now everyone's like, win it for Dustin Brown. And I think that even the team now is going in because they didn't know either until he announced it or right before. And so the team now as well is they're going to take it up a level to try to do their best to get Dustin Brown as far as they can before he hangs it up. And that man is going to leave it all out on the ice no matter what happens.
Well, and that's the thing too, is leaving it out all on the ice. And Edmonton, you're always scared about, someone gets Connor the wrong way or someone gets Leon the right way. Edmonton might be a little messed up if they stay. I mean, we saw what happened against Vancouver. It wasn't exactly our best performance without the two of them. If we lose one of them, and maybe that's because of a Dustin Brown energy type play, and that could be very big. I'm wondering if the Oilers can match that intensity because, again, Dustin Brown has been there before. There's guys like Lemieux on the Kings. Like, I get a little shivery when I think of a couple of guys that can start going into those corners against the Edmonton Oilers.
Yeah. And Dustin Brown he's never been one to shy away from it before. He definitely isn't going to now. There are going to be some heavy hits from that man who's just gonna, if you're in his way, look out.
Look out. And one of the final things I want to ask you is, it comes down to the crease, at least on my side as well. I mean, I'm sure we will get into Mike Smith as well in a little bit from the Kings' point of view, but from the Oilers' point of view, looking at Jonathan Quick, again, we've mentioned Drew Doughty, who's been there before. Obviously, he won't be in this series this year, but we mentioned Kopitar and Dustin Brown. Jonathan Quick was that goaltender for those cup-winning teams, and he's been back there and seen Mike Smith in playoff spots, played against tough teams in those playoffs, and has been there before. Goaltending is very overstated and understated in the playoffs. How much does Jonathan Quick really factor in for the LA Kings this year?
I think he's going to be huge. He is the big reason why the Kings are here at all. After the past couple years of him having really down seasons, it's like the demise of Jonathan Quick has been greatly over exaggerated, because he has looked fantastic for most of the season. Everyone has a stinker, even your best goaltender in the league. Even Andre Vasilevsky gets lit up every so often, but Quick has looked fantastic. He's already in playoff form. I think in their last press conference, they asked him about Mike Smith, and his answer was basically something along the lines of well, he's a goalie, he stops pucks, and that was it. Peak Jonathan Quick, just very man of very few words, but he has looked fantastic. And any questions that were existed about who was really going to take over the crease this year, Jonathan Quick was like, no, I'm not ready to go. And so he, like you said, we'll talk about Mike Smith coming up next, but for the Kings, as Jonathan Quick goes, so does this team. But it is good to know that if he does falter at some point, that even though Cal Peterson's had a rough year, that I still trust him to come in if you need him, and have that experience. But yeah, Jonathan Quick has been fantastic this season, and he is a guy who always takes it up a level in the playoffs. So I'm really excited to see what he brings.
Well, and that was going to be my final question before we turn into the Oilers side of things, or into everything here, is that if Jonathan Quick maybe does falter or maybe does go down to an injury, how comfortable are you, or are the LA Kings even, with Cal Peterson in net? It seemed like they kind of split the time a little bit since the deadline, or at least since the start of February. And it seems like LA's pretty okay with putting in both goaltenders. Do you think you're comfortable, or are the LA Kings comfortable with
I think they'll be comfortable with it. They've definitely been running kind of a 1A, 1B for this season and last season. And the intent really was, this season was really supposed to be the year where Cal Peterson kind of rose up and took over the net. And Jonathan Quick was like, oh, I think not. And you're not going to take it, he's the better goalie right now. You're not going to take it away from him just because you're like, you're winding down, but you're going to let him go with it. But this was, I think, the first season since Jonathan Quick became the starter that he didn't get the home opener. They gave it to Cal Peterson. Right. He looked great. It's a game that now everyone kind of looks back on, because it was the Kings and Vegas, and the Kings crushed them. And, I'm sure Vegas is looking at it. They've got a lot of opportunities, but looking at that game particularly, and is like, man. But, I think that Peterson, it might be a little rocky if he does have to come in while he sort of gets back into form. But, I think that he has shown historically that he can be a great goaltender and is still kind of the future of the franchise. So if it happens that he needs to be called into action, I'm not super worried, but Quick has been lights out. So
the go-to. I love it. Well, obviously we are going to get to more of the crease questions, because let's be real. It does kind of come down to the crease for the Oilers, especially with the 1A, 1B situation the Oilers have gone into. But before we get into that, I want to tell you about one of our sponsors, BetOnline. BetOnline is your number one source for all of your betting, stats, and sports information. Find all of the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL playoffs, which we're obviously talking about right now. The Oilers are sitting at a minus 225 favorite, and the Kings are sitting at a plus 195 underdog, so you can make some money betting on either side there. Plus, the MLB is in full swing now. They have some stats on that as well. Bet Online is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs to esports and much more. Head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. Bet Online, where the game starts. Sarah, there are a lot of questions around the Edmonton Oilers. There's always questions about how far or not they can go. I want to hear what questions you have when it comes to the Edmonton Oilers heading into this series.
Well, we'll just start with in the net, because Mike Smith has been a question mark really his whole career. Like he's been a great goalie, but then you blink and you're like, oh no, what just happened? And when I asked for questions from Locked On Kings listeners, one of my listeners, James, his question was, how nervous are you about Mike Smith? No, really, how nervous are you about Mike Smith? So what's your take there?
I'm going to be 100% honest with you. If the playoffs started a month ago, I would be shivering in my boots and I wouldn't be comfortable. I would not be comfortable at all. However, since the playoffs are starting on Monday, tonight, I truly think that I'm confident with Mike Smith in the net. If it gets to Mikko Koskinen or gets to a kind of a platoon situations, I might be sweating a little bit more. But since February 10th, even, Mike Smith has been the sixth best goaltender when it comes to goals against average in the entire NHL. When it comes to with 2.40, goals against in that month. And it really has come down to how Jay Woodcroft has honestly deployed the defense. There's been guys like Cody Ceci who has stepped up and kind of put Mike Smith in less pressure situations, having to play the puck, as we've seen. Has kind of bit him sometimes, and the Oilers sometimes as well. Also, since the trade deadline, Mike Smith has a .931 save percentage, which is good enough for best in the league.
All right. Crazy.
And I'm like, I know, right? I'm kind of sitting here like, ooh, okay. Obviously, Mike Smith and Jonathan Quick and Mike Smith and the LA Kings have met a bunch of times in the playoffs, or a couple of times in the playoffs. And the Kings have gotten the best of him basically every time they played. So that's kind of sitting in the back of my mind in the confidence bin. But when you look at the numbers and at least how Edmonton has been playing the last couple of weeks, I'm more comfortable with him in that.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting, because he is a goaltender who, especially the older players on the team, know very well. And I think is a little bit of a different situation than, teams with newer goaltenders or teams that had, a lot of changes. This is a guy who is in the Pacific Division, especially, very well known. It's just that the makeup of the team in front of him is, you got Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. So that's a pretty big one. I guess for Kings fans, and also the fact that we have Kings versus Oilers, but we don't get Drew Doughty versus Connor McDavid is honestly a disappointment, because I know he just has such beef, because he gets burned by Connor McDavid all the time. Kings fans can admit that because it just happens. And I'm like, man, we're going into the playoffs and we're not going to get that. That's crazy. But, obviously 2 of the best players in the league. How do you stop them? How do you make them not do that?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of teams are still trying to figure that out, especially Pittsburgh as well, who the last 2 times Connor has played against them, he's put up 8 points. which is pretty good. But honestly, when you especially take a look at how Winnipeg and Chicago played Leon and Connor in the last two playoff series, and I put playoffs in kind of air quotes because of the bubble and stuff, but yeah, we'll have fun with that one. But they really locked them down. They almost played them how Jonathan Toews played Zdeno Chara against Boston a couple years ago, just always in their face, always making them think about who's on the ice, who's coming out next, and just always not necessarily letting them think about the next play that they want to do, making sure that they're thinking the next play that your player is going to want to do, whether that's a Sean Durzi, which, as we've talked about, is not scared about getting underneath their skin. Leon Draisaitl last season was the Oilers' playoff goal scorer extraordinaire in the 4 games that we played against Winnipeg, and he had 2 goals in those 4 games. So honestly, if there's any sort of handcuff on the two of them, it's maybe a tough game for the Oilers.
Yeah, I think a lot about, we didn't really talk about him in the first segment, but Phil Deneau, who the Kings acquired and who has been fantastic for the team. And I think a lot about how he shut down Mark Stone when he was with the Canadiens in that playoff series. And so for me, when I'm watching this, I'm like, is he going to be able to do the same thing? Like, who knows? I'm really fascinated to watch this matchup. If they do somehow manage to shut down one or both of them, dream scenario here. Who is there to pick up the slack? Because it's always one of those things where it's like, oh, you shut down the top guy, but then you just got scored on by this kid you never heard of. What's the kind of remainder of the roster look like there?
It's got to be Vander Kane, unfortunately. I know a lot of California hockey fans know him quite well for the wrong type of things. But up here in Edmonton, he's been doing the right thing, staying out of the limelight for the wrong things and really been producing. He has a 44-goal pace this season just on Connor McDavid's line. You have guys like Jesse Puljujärvi, who up here in Edmonton has really been getting the nines. The media has really been getting on him recently just because of his production. And Kylie Yamamoto is another name that I think the Oilers really need to get going in the playoffs. In the playoffs last season against Winnipeg, he only had 1 assist when the Oilers really needed him to help drive the lineup. If Connor and Leon weren't going to be available or weren't going to be a force, and they weren't, and neither was Kyler, and the Oilers got swept. So it's very doable. As Edmonton Oilers fans well know, going into the playoffs last year, we got Winnipeg. We got Winnipeg. So it very much depends on those 3 players, whether or not if Connor and Leon do get locked up, if we can get that secondary scoring from the next top 6.
All right. And one more thing before we move on to some predictions and some top players to look out for. I want to talk real briefly about special teams, because I know sometimes people kind of look at the Oilers and they're like, oh, well, you got Draisaitl and McDavid on the power play, of course. But then you look at all of the points that they have at even strength. And I saw on Twitter somewhere was like, McDavid has more points at even strength than literally anyone on the Kings at any strength, which, the Kings are, they're a lower scoring team. Like it's a funny stat, but I'm like, oh, it's also Connor McDavid. He has like 800 points this season or something. So what does the special teams picture look like? Is this a series that, Kings fans should want played at even strength to just avoid all of that?
Honestly, I'm not even sure when it comes to the Oilers power play right now. The Oilers power play has really, I don't want to say failed underneath Jay Woodcroft, because I don't think they have. But when you look at how the Oilers power play specifically was doing underneath Dave, I almost called him Dave Woodcroft, Dave Tippett, as opposed to under Jay Woodcroft, you're not really getting the same producing from the top pairing as you were, or top unit rather, than you are now. However, you're getting scoring from both units now from the Oilers. So it may not be as heavy as a pace for the Oilers on the power play, but they are kind of producing with more players. On the flip side, the penalty kill has looked great, especially going into the playoffs. The Oilers have had some issues when it comes to too many men penalties, because we do deploy the 11-7 program here, and we've had some. Yeah, exactly. Right. New coach. Why not try something new? and it's worked, but we've had some issues getting guys on and off the ice.
Mhm.
And against Columbus, who was kind of a lowly team, it ended up kind of hurting us. And if we get in that penalty trouble, especially for unforced errors, it could be an issue.
Do you think they're going to do the 11-7 thing in the playoffs?
I do. I really do. Yeah, I really do. I think you'll see. It depends on Darnell Nurse as well. If he's healthy, then we will see more, because the Oilers did just bring up Philip Broberg as well. But yeah, I do think 11-7 is going to be the way to go. They just had too much success under it.
Why not? Why not?
Exactly.
It's spicy. I like it. Well, we will close things out by talking about some players and moments that could help define this series. But before we get to that, I want to tell you all about snacks, because I know I'm a big stress eater, and the playoffs are like, it's been so long since I've had to experience this that I need to like get back into it. But I'm definitely going to be just like eating, I think, through the whole playoffs. And one great option to do that in a way that is also going to be good for me is to go and get myself some Built Bars. If you don't know what a Built Bar is, they are healthy, they're delicious, they're covered in 100% chocolate, and they're also actually good for you. So with Built Bars, you can both have something that is delicious and something that is good for you. All you have to do is go to built.com and check out what they've got available. They have basically any flavor you could think of. If you're someone who likes sweet things, if you're someone who likes berry flavored things, they've got options. They have the Built Puffs, which are protein infused marshmallows, which come in the locked on favorite churro flavor. We all love that one, so it is definitely a big hit here at Locked On. They also now have like Built granola bars, which I'm super excited to try too. So they've got something for everybody. So go to built.com. You can check out all the nutrition information, see exactly how they fit into your life, compare them to candy, and you're going to see that Built Bars are just way better for you nutritionally. And again, they taste super good. So go to built.com, use promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your order. That is promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. All right, so we are going to wrap up today. We're going to look at a couple things. We're going to look at players who could help determine the series. I should make it hard on you and say not McDavid or Draisaitl.
That's fair.
We're also going to look at matchups to watch for, and then much to my chagrin, we're going to make some predictions. I hate predictions, but we're going to do it. So we'll start with you. Who are your key players for this series?
Yes, and I will stray away from the McDavid and the Draisaitl. Also stray away from Mike Smith and the Evander Kane, because we have kind of talked about them already. I think, because in Edmonton, there's always been kind of a folklore of who the next Fernando Pisani is going. And for the Oilers, I mentioned this on a week from last week, an episode from last week, I should say. I think it's going to be Warren Foegele. I think Warren Fogel's going to be the guy. Yeah, McLovin. I'm here for it. Just he's really picked it up underneath Jay Woodcroft. He stepped up his goals for per 60 minutes for the Oilers, and has really been putting in the time, not only in the defensive zone, but in the offensive zone. And as we know, defense turns into offense, and hopefully that can be kind of a turning point for Warren Foegele. As an Edmonton Oiler, he has kind of had some tough times up here, but I'm interested to see who you think the LA Kings X Factor will be here as well.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Phil Deneau. We talked about him a little bit earlier. He has been so good for this team. He has hit career highs in goals and points, I think, as well, and has really done exactly what they paid him to do, which was take some of the pressure off of Anze Kopitar. Now the Kings have two top lines that other teams have to figure out a matchup for. You know, it's like, okay, if I don't want my guy to go up against Kopitar, well, now he's got to face Deneau, who is just defensively magnificent. And like I said earlier, he was instrumental in that Canadiens run to the final. Canadiens fans are still lamenting the fact that they let him go. And so I think that he is going to be a huge factor in, you know, helping shut down whoever comes up against him. I'm looking forward to seeing him just go beast mode in these playoffs, because he's been a treat in the regular season, and I think he's going to be huge for this team in a playoff run.
Well, that's that. As an Oilers fan, sitting over here and thinking, "Wow, LA has two very good, strong,
Mhm.
full-rounded centers." And as we saw with Winnipeg, if you are to lock those two down, that
Yeah.
may be very important. Plus, Leon and Connor lines now, so
Oh, ooh.
yeah, yeah. So
Good.
hey, they're always be seeing either a Kopitar or a Dano. So I really dig that. Is that going to be one of the key matchups? Do you think?
I do. I really do. I think that, it'll be interesting to see, especially, whichever team has let like the last change, who's going to go out there against them. And it really is going to be that matchup of who goes up against Kopitar, who goes up against Dano. If we had Drew Doughty, I would say Doughty versus McDavid was going to be a huge matchup, but he's sitting in the press box. So, yeah, I mean that those are my key matchups because like we've said, for the Oilers, if you can shut them down, it's going to change the whole complexion of this series. The Kings, for the first time in a long time, have scoring kind of up and down their lineup. They actually have guys on all four lines who can score, and so even if those top two lines kind of come to a draw because they're busy fighting McDavid and Draisaitl the whole time, there's guys on those bottom two lines who will score, which is very weird as a Kings fan to think that because it didn't happen for the past couple of years.
No kidding. I'm a big fan of Arthur Kaliev as well, a guy
Mhm.
that I've watched a lot during his World Junior days, and I'm excited to see how he can kind of step into an important lineup, especially because he is playing more on the power play now for the Kings.
Mhm.
Am I correct there?
Yeah. He's still like mostly like at even strength. He's kind of on the bottom, like bottom six. I think next year that won't be the situation, but for right now they got him in the lineup. But he has put in some great goals, especially on the power play, and I think his ability to set up his teammates is really underrated.
Yeah.
And so I expect to see him, either get some goals of his own or make some really crazy passes to help out a teammate.
Well, and Kaliev has put up some points for the against the Oilers for the Kings as well.
Mhm.
Again, you mentioned the passing, but the shooting is just
Yeah.
bar none amazing. And that's actually going to be my matchup. Will be the play or the power play of the Kings against the penalty kill of the Oilers. I think the Oilers' penalty kill has been quite strong, as I mentioned, as of late, but you never can go down a
Mhm.
man or even two, especially in the playoffs. So I think that will certainly be the bread and butter for both teams.
Yeah, that's gonna be. And the Kings power play has also kind of gone in cycles. There's been times where it's been really great. There's been times where it's like, can we just decline this penalty and not do it? But
Yeah.
they've had Adrian Kempe has put up a ton of goals this season. A lot have been on the power play. Dustin Brown is that guy who just stands in front of the net and lets it go in off him. So if they get clicking on the power play, it'll be interesting to watch to see how that goes. What is your prediction for the series?
I hear you when it comes to the predictions. I'm always wrong, and I always get caught up in my own, not bias, but just what I want to see. Uh,
Mhm.
every time I sit down and I listen more about just what the Kings can produce and what the Kings can offer, I get just that much more. Oh no, is this going to be Winnipeg again? Unfortunately for Kings fans, I do think that it is not going to be like Winnipeg or Chicago. I do think the Oilers will take it in 6. I'm going to give one extra game because I was going to say Oilers in 5, but I just don't have the right seating in my stomach. I'm going to say Oilers in 6.
So, Locked On Kings fans already know this. For Locked On Oilers fans who are listening, it really feels like all season, whenever I predicted the Kings to do well, they've
Yeah.
blown it. They've disappointed me. They've been like terrible. And so I kind of stopped predicting the Kings to win things. And so they would go into a game against like the Coyotes. And I'm like, they're going to get blown out of the water. The Coyotes going to win this. And then the Kings would win. So I've been kind of working on like a reverse jinx kind of thing here. So I'm
Yeah.
also going to go with the Oilers in 6. Legitimately, I do feel like the more, like you said, the more I think about the series, the more I'm like, this could be sort of a coin flip. There's so many ways that I could see it tipping in either direction, but I'm going to go Oilers in 6. I have to respect the like accidental superstition I've created this season. But I think it's going to be a fun series from the Kings perspective. Like you said before we started recording, they're kind of playing with house money. They weren't really expected to be here. And at this point, any playoff experience we get these young guys is going to be great for building in the future. So they win, they win. They don't win, they don't win. At least Dustin Brown gets to go out probably like annihilating some Oilers player at some point in time. And it's just going to be fun. I'm excited to see it, but I also have to go with the Oilers because I gotta respect the accidental mess I've gotten myself into here.
I hear that. And yeah, unfortunately, I'm the same way with the superstition, but obviously you have something going on there. Yes, we will have 2 games. The 2 games in Edmonton are on Monday and Wednesday. Then they do fly down to Los Angeles, sunny, beautiful Los Angeles. I'm sorry, I'm getting caught up in it there, on Friday and for Sunday as well. So those will be at least the 4 guaranteed games. Then back to Edmonton, back to LA, back to Edmonton for the 7th game. Sarah, thank you so much for putting the bug in my ear just in case that we might lose. But I also want to say, just like you said, with the experience that the LA Kings will gain with their younger players, hopefully this will be a yearly tradition that we might have in the future.
Yeah, I'm very excited. It's been a blast. We'll have to catch up for a postmortem at the end, no matter what happens. For people who want to keep up with the Oilers side of things throughout the playoffs, where can they find you and your show?
Yes, you can find Locked On Oilers anywhere you find your podcast, free and available. You can also find us on YouTube at Locked On Oilers, and you can also follow me on Twitter at TheRealHolden40. And what about you, Sarah?
So you can find Locked On Kings, of course, wherever you get your podcasts, also on the YouTube. I'm on Twitter at Right Said Sarah. For people listening, not watching, it's WRITE Said Sarah with an H. Locked On Kings is on Twitter at Locked On LA Kings. And also, if you do not already listen to Locked On NHL, our national show, I co-host Wednesdays, where we talk all about the conference. So you'll be sure to hear some Kings Oilers takes on our weekly Locked On NHL shows as well. So this has been and can't wait to see what happens next.